Hello friends, welcome back to my channel. I'm Em, and this is going to be my best books of 2024. Okay, I always put off filming this as long as possible, and by always, I mean this is only the second time I've done a best books of the year video, so a whole 2 times, but I really hate having to whittle down what I've read in a year to the best books. I waffle on this list a lot. I get so worried I am going to forget something or leave something out, but I feel pretty good about the list as it stands now. I might film a video later reflecting on 2024 reading, but I also might not. I am pretty excited for 2025, and I don't have a lot of inclination or desire to look back and reflect on 2024 reading. I'm just ready to like shut the door on it and move on. So I think that's what I'm going to do, because that feels right. We are going to start off by talking about my honorable mentions. These are books that if I was going to have like a top 15 or a top 20, they would definitely make the list. They are not necessarily 5 stars, but more like 4.5 stars, or just books that I had a lot of fun reading, or even I think a couple 5 stars that could have been on the top 10 list, but I just wasn't quite obsessed with them enough for them to be on the official "these are my favorite books I read in 2024" list. So anyways, I'll stop doing the preamble and we'll get into it. I don't have copies of all the books I'm going to talk about because some of them were library books or ebooks, and I've just never gotten around to purchasing a finished copy, or I'm not interested in purchasing a finished copy because it's not a book I see myself rereading, or because at least in one case, a physical book doesn't exist for it. Let's start with that one so that I don't forget about it. This is Mrs. Milner Gets a Kitchen by Jane Hadley, I believe is the author's name. I hope I'm right because I definitely didn't write it down. And this is a novella. It's a historical romance. It's also a mid-century modern historical romance. It's set in the 1950s, and it is about Mrs. Milner, who is a divorced mother of 2, and she lives in this really tight-knit but also very gossipy community. And in the settlement with her husband and their divorce, he has given her a lot of money, and she decides that she wants to use that money to remodel her kitchen and give herself a state-of-the-art, borderline futuristic kitchen, because she figures she spends so much time in the kitchen anyways as a mom that she might as well be in a space that she enjoys and that is functional. And it's a romance between her and the contractor hired to install her kitchen, and it was so delightful. I was not expecting to fall in love with these characters or to love this romance as much as I did. I was also surprised because she has children, and historically I do not like children in romance novels. I don't want them there. I don't need them there. I like, go away. But I thought the children in this particular book were used very well to help further the romance between the 2 main characters. Now, I will say the third act breakup, the third act fight bothered me so much because it was just real bad communication between the 2 of them, but that is pretty standard for me in romance. I am also almost never going to think the third act breakup is worth a breakup or needs to be there. So I usually don't let that affect my rating for books, but I really love this. I even really loved the steamy scenes in this book, and I normally just kind of skim and skip over the steamy scenes, but I thought they're really well done and used really well to help further along the romance and the emotional intimacy for the 2 main characters. So just absolutely lovely if you like historical romance, or if maybe like you want to step into historical romance but Victorian era or Regency era just feels too far removed from contemporary. This would be a good like baby step. Okay, next up we have The Lord of Starling by A.J. Lancaster. This is my favorite type of fantasy where it's historical, it's our world, but it's fantasy adjacent. And so this isn't technically our world, it's a different one, but it is structured very much like Victorian era England. And there's the same rules for gender and for behavior in polite society, but there are fae in this world. And in this book, Hedda has been called back to the family estate because her father has passed away, and all the descendants need to come back to do the ritual for the land to pick who the next heir will be. Hedda knows it won't be her, but she needs to go home and go through all the pomp and circumstance, which she doesn't really want to do because she has a complicated relationship with her family. But then something goes awry with the choosing and it becomes infinitely more complicated. So I really love a callback to historical romance because that was my first bookish genre obsession. And so it always has a soft spot in my heart, and I really love it even more when there is magic thrown in. There are fae in this book. There is the lovely beginnings of a romance between Hedda and another character that I'm not going to tell you who it is because it's kind of a spoiler, but it's also not really a surprise once you start reading the book. Once you meet that character, you're like, oh yeah, that's who I want her to fall in love with. But I loved the mystery in here and the environment and the world that was set up. This is book 1 in a series, and I'm so excited to continue on with this series and to watch this romance between Hedda and the other person get like just develop more, because it was really just the start of this one. Kind of how in historical mystery series, like the romance takes multiple books to really get going. So I think that's the kind of situation I'm in for this one. But again, I just loved the writing. I loved the world building. The beginning of the romance was so swoony, and it was one of those books where I was totally swept up in the reading experience. I just think it's tragically underread, in my opinion. Most of the books on my honorable mentions are fantasy, so we're going to break it up with some horror. I have American Rapture by C.J. Lead. This is apocalyptic horror. This is set in our world in contemporary times, and there is a virus going through the United States, not unlike COVID, except this one turns people into less crazed creatures. And there is a lot of religious trauma in this book, which I have found really works for me. We're following Sophie, who is 16, and she has been raised in a really conservative, strict religious household and is very uninformed and very sheltered from the world and the way the world works and the way people are in the world and all the different complexities of being human. And she embarks on a road trip to get to her twin brother, who is several hours away from her family home. And it's a little bit of found family. It's definitely a road trip book. Again, tons of religious drama. It's really violent, but I loved how C.J. Lead introduced characters. I really love the journey Sophie went on. I think I already said this, but I find religious trauma in horror novels to be a really cathartic reading experience for me, so I love that aspect. This is the horror book that has made me sob at the end. It's the only one that's ever made me sob, and I definitely have become, I'm not as much of a crier when I read as I used to be, but this one broke me. It broke me. It was so good. Highly recommend. Do check out content warnings for this one if you maybe swing on the more sensitive side of being a reader, but I'm going to assume that if you're on the more sensitive side, you are not picking up horror. But if you are, definitely check content warnings, because C.J. Lead does not care about your feelings, and she's gonna hurt the ones you love, whether you like it or not. And then next we have the book that started my year-long obsession with Chloe Gong, and that is These Violent Delights. And this is book 1 in, I'm not sure what the series is called, but this is book 1 in a duology that is a Romeo and Juliet retelling that is set in an alternate 1920s Shanghai. And I love this duology so much. It's so good. I loved the romance between Juliet and Roma. They are in rival families that split control of Shanghai, and just the drama. Having these different family factions gave this a political fantasy component that I really, really loved. I really loved all the Easter eggs for Romeo and Juliet in this. I thought that was just fantastic, and it made it so fun to read. And they are things that if you've never read Romeo and Juliet, you can pick this up, no problem, and read it, and you won't miss out on anything. But if you have any familiarity with that story, it is so fun to pick up on those in this book. And again, I just absolutely loved Juliet and Roma. I love their characters. I love their dynamic. I loved that they had really good reasons for why they couldn't be together, because listen, if you're going to give me a romance and those characters are not going to be together every single second on the page, you need to give me a real good reason why that they cannot be together. And Chloe Gong gave me a real good reason why they can't be together, and I just ate it up. And then the last honorable mention is a book that I credit with making me ready to step into the romantasy pool. And I don't know that this is good. I'm not going to claim that it's good, but I had a really good time with it, and I really like it, which is really all this list is books that I like. And this is The Liar's Crown by Abigail Owen. This is a YA romantasy, but really it's like, it says it's YA, but it's not YA, okay? Okay, this is about sisters, and one is born to rule, and the other is born to protect her sister. And I picked it up because that just gave me Frozen vibes, and I am a sucker for something that sounds like Frozen, and I was just all in. I was just all in. I really like the world building. I love the main character. I loved the romance in this first book. Now the second book isn't on this honorable mentions because there was less romance in the second book and more political fantasy, which is fine, but like, I loved it. I loved it. I love watching a love interest resist. And our love interest, Revan, he resists so hard. He does his best to resist. Why can't I remember her name? I hate when the synopsis is first person. That is not helpful. Mare. Her name's Mare. Okay. I feel silly for forgetting that. Anyways, Revan tries to resist Mare to the best of his ability, but he just can't do it, and I love it. This also introduced me to what a shadow daddy is, and I understand all these plot devices, at least as far as I can tell, are not original, that they're kind of considered typical of romantasy, but since it was really my first step into this subgenre, I ate it up, and I just loved it, and I have the final book on my shelf, and I cannot wait to read it. It's gonna be so good. Those are all my honorable mentions, so now we can get into top 10. So the 10th book on my list is Diola. This is by Jennifer Thorne. This is a horror that is set mostly in Italy, but this is about a very toxic family who goes on vacation together and unknowingly book a haunted villa in Tuscany. And it is unsettling, and it is creepy, and it's one of those books that has so much tension in it, and some of that tension is because of the haunted house and the ghost and the supernatural element, and some of it is because this family just waiting to see what heinous thing they are going to say to each other next. And my hallmark for what makes a horror a 5-star is how hard I am rooting for the main character, how desperately I want them to be safe and to be okay and to have all these horrible things stop happening to them. And I think Jennifer Thorne accomplished this so wonderfully in this book, because gosh, did I want our main character to be okay. Never wanted anything more in my life than for this character to make it out alive. I also think that this was genuinely a pretty creepy book. I found I have a fairly high scare tolerance for horror, which is incredible because I do not have a high scare threshold for horror movies, but apparently in horror books, I can rock with a lot. I also don't read books that are super creepy on purpose because I'm worried I'll prove myself wrong, but this one was so creepy with the things that were going on in the house and what would happen to characters, what they saw that was really happening but maybe also wasn't happening, and just the way it all unraveled. I found the ending so satisfying, and this is definitely one of my favorite horror, because we have one more on the list, of the year. Number 9 is a book that I was excited for for a while waiting for it to come out, and then I have been pleasantly surprised to see other people really love this book as well in 2024. I've seen this on quite a few best of lists, and it just makes me so happy because I love seeing this author get more love because I think he flies pretty under the radar most of the time, or at least has in the past. And it is How to Become the Dark Lord and Die Trying by Django Wexler. This is an RPG type fantasy where our main character, Davi, is from Earth but has somehow ended up in this fantasy world, and she's been tasked with defeating the Dark Lord, but every time she fails, she resets to what is essentially her saved point. So she wakes up in the same place, in the same position, with the same person standing over her, ready to intone what her path is supposed to be. And at the time this book picks up, Davi has been through this song and dance over 200 times, and she is done. She's done with dying. She's done with starting over again. She's tried 200 different ways, over 200 different ways to defeat the Dark Lord. And on this time, she decides, what if I just become the Dark Lord instead? And then she has to set about recruiting the team and, most importantly, staying alive long enough to become the Dark Lord. This book is really vulgar and funny and super horny. Like, Davi is maybe the horniest character I think I've ever read, but it was so much fun. It was really lighthearted, and it was lighthearted but still with high stakes and with characters that it was easy to root for. Like I said, I've long been a fan of Django Wexler, and I love his writing style. I love how he constructs his world building, and I've always really loved like the humor and the camp that he has in this book, and I felt like this just took the camp that I already really liked and just dialed it up to a 10, and it was a good time. Like, if you want lighthearted fantasy, I highly recommend this. If you liked Kings of the Wild by Nicholas Ames, I would definitely recommend picking up How to Become the Dark Lord and Die Trying. I think they have a lot of similar characteristics, though nobody in King of the Wild is going to be as horny as Davi is. All right, number 8 is the second horror book I have on this list and the last horror book. And it's a book I do not own because I don't like how it made me feel at the end, but the way it made me feel and how long I have thought about this book and how often I have continued to think about it after reading it means it has to be somewhere on this list, because I read it well over 6 months ago and still think about it on a regular basis, and that is Bloom by Delilah S. Dawson. I doubt I am the first person who has to put this book on their best of list, but this is a horror novella, and it starts out like a cottagecore sapphic romance. We have Ro, who is, I believe she's either a professor or I think she's a professor, like pretty young in her career, and she's just broken up with her ex-boyfriend, and she goes to this farmer's market and meets a woman named Ash who has a stand there, and this relationship starts between the two of them. And oh my God, the tension built in this book is so slow and so steady but so insidious, because for a long time it just is a slowly building romance, though let me tell you, there are red flags, and you are going to see the red flags immediately and be screaming at Ro to also see the red flags. And then it takes a turn, and it gets so dark and so gross and so disturbing, and I was nauseous after finishing this book for like hours afterwards, and it was a whole experience. But I loved the writing so much, and I loved the tension and how slowly but expertly it kept tightening throughout the book. I just thought it was so well done. And again, I have thought about it on a regular basis ever since. Also, I am seeing all of you who are talking about this book and are calling Ro Rosemary, which is the name she says she doesn't like to be called. Don't do that. Every time I see it, I go, oh, so yeah. Anyways, because that's a whole thing in the book. The whole thing in the book. Red flag for people who don't call you by your preferred name. Am I right? But this was just so fun, so creepy. It's such a quick read. but it's so impactful for the number of pages that it is. I definitely don't recommend reorganizing your bookshelves before filming the best books of the year video. It's so hard to find things right now. Number 7 is The Spell Shop by Sarah Beth Durst. This is a cozy fantasy book that came out earlier this year, and this is like the closest to a perfect cozy fantasy I've found since reading Legends and Lattes a few years ago. This is about Keela, who is a librarian at this big fancy library, like the fantasy version of Oxford or the Bodleian Library or something like that. And there is a revolution in the city and the library is set on fire, and Keela and her sentient spider plant friend Kaz escape with as many books as she can rescue, but she's not supposed to have these books. She's essentially stolen them, even though she's rescued them from being burned. And she retreats back to the island that she was raised on, but hasn't been on in years, and sets about trying to rebuild a life for herself. And there is a little bit of a romance, but I think this book is more about the act of Keela finding community and finding friends and learning how to be a part of society because she's isolated herself for so long. This had just enough plot and high stakes to be interesting, and I loved the island, this town that Sarah Beth Durst created, and all the different inhabitants and all the different creatures that also live on the island. I really loved the magic system in this book and how magic affects everything, the weather, the people, the food that these people are able to grow. It was just such an integral part of the world, and I really ate that up, and I thought this is just a lovely, lovely book. Kaz, the sentient spider plant, definitely stole the show for me. But if you also like cozy fantasy, but you like your cozy fantasy to have a little bit of high stakes, I would definitely recommend this one. All right, and then I feel like this one is like the true departure from this group. We have Cloud Cuckoo Land by Anthony Dower. How do I explain this book? This is a lot of things. This is literary fiction. This is science fiction. This is historical fiction. It's got a lot of stuff going on. I was really intimidated to read this for a long time, and then once I picked it up, I found that I couldn't put it down. And I read this like 500, 600 page chonker. It's over 600 pages. I read this in 3 days because I just could not put it down. It, again, splits a lot of timelines and follows a lot of different threads, and it's so good. The writing is really good. I really love how Anthony Doerr develops character and the way he made me care for the characters in this book. If you really like sweeping, multi-generational, but then also kind of not stories, because we're following 3 different, very, very different people in very, very different times. We're following somebody in 15th century Constantinople. We're in a small town in present-day Idaho. We're on an interstellar spaceship way, way, way in the future. We're just following all these different people and seeing how these very different stories are, at the end of the day, all connected to each other and all depend on each other. And it was just so masterfully done. I would say even if you read Anthony Doerr in the past and haven't liked him, I would still recommend picking this up and giving it a try because it's just so wildly different from any of the other things that he's written in the past. Another book that I do not own because I haven't gotten around to it yet, but I will be adding it to my shelves at some point, is Voyage of the Damned by Frances White. All right, I've seen a couple people describe this as Agatha Christie meets, I don't remember what the other one was, but they describe it as like Agatha Christie. This is not like Agatha Christie. If you've heard that, I need you to erase that from your brain, because if you go into this expecting Agatha Christie style writing, I think you are going to be disappointed, and I don't think you will like it if that is your expectation. So if you like a disaster, queer, chaotic main character who is also your first person narrator, so that voice is going to be with you the whole time, in a locked room, basically murder mystery, then yes, I think you will like this. But we are following this world where there are, was it 12 or 13? There's all these different provinces, and each province has a different animal that is their ruling house. And this voyage takes place every year or every few years, and it's the heirs of the different provinces are on this boat, and they are going to this mountain to do this ritual, blah, 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 political fantasy reasons. But they're all fairly young, like teens, early 20s. And the first night on this particular voyage, the heir of the ruling province is murdered. But you cannot turn the ship around once it has sailed, and so they are all stuck on this boat until it reaches its destination as the bodies are dropping. And they have to make alliances, and they have to decide who to trust and who not to trust. And I just loved the main character so much. I am a sucker for a disaster, chaotic, queer narrator. It works for me every time. I love the unhingedness that comes along with following that character. I loved the romance in here, though Frances White did hurt my feelings, and I had to work through it. I had to decide whether or not I was going to forgive them or not. Ultimately, I did, because I really like how it worked out. But just know, they're going to hurt your feelings a little bit. At least mine were hurt a little bit, because I got too attached to somebody that I shouldn't get attached to. And then when I realized the mistake I had made, oh, that was sad. That was a sad day. But I really loved this. I loved the mystery. I loved the environment. I really liked the kingdoms and how all the providences and all the animals, and obviously like not all animals are created equal. And so there is a hierarchy depending on which province you are born into. But I loved it so much. And I picked this up on a whim. I did not think I was going to like it because I saw Mara from Books Like Whoa had read it and just had had a fine experience. I think she gave it 3 stars. But I just absolutely gobbled it up once I got started. I gave it 5 stars. I love it so much. And this was Frances White's debut, and I cannot wait to see what she writes next. All right, another one that I do not own yet, because I just haven't gotten around to it, is The Truth of the Aleke by Moses Osei Utomi. This is a second book in the Forever Desert trilogy, which is a novella series. Book 1 is The Lies of the Ajongo, and I love this series so much. The way this author compact so much into such a short book. The Lies of the Ajongo is only maybe 100 pages, and The Lies of the Aleke is not much longer. This one is following a totally different time, totally different characters. We're in the same world, but a lot of time has passed since the events of book 1, and it was definitely a much heavier book for me to read. In his author notes, Utomi talks about how the events of this book were really inspired by 9/11 and in the way United States media and the general public responded to Muslim people and Muslim American citizens. And so you can really feel that in this book. It does feel heavier and sadder. And so for only being approximately 100 pages, it did take me a long time to work my way through it because I had to take breaks to recover emotionally before I continued reading. But I find his writing to be beautiful. If we were rating these books just on writing skill, it would be number 1 because I find his writing so beautiful and perfectly impactful for the amount of pages he is writing in. His books never feel too long. They never feel too short. It's always the perfect length, and it's very cool and impressive how much he is able to pack into what is ultimately a very short book. And so if you haven't read the series yet, I highly recommend it. It's his debut series, book 3. The finale comes out in 2025, and I'm so excited to see what he does next in this world and how he brings the story to a close. All right, next up we have Two Twisted Crowns by Rachel Gillig. We're going in a total opposite direction. This is the second book in, what is this called? The Shepherd King duology. This is a dark fantasy series with a heavy romance element. This is the sequel to One Dark Window. I read Dark Window when it first came out, and I gave it a 4-star. I liked it okay. And then I read Two Twisted Crowns this year, and I gave it 5 stars. I think this one is so good. I think One Dark Window is good, but like if you read One Dark Window and were like, oh, it's fine, I would still say pick up Two Twisted Crowns because I think it's even better. In One Dark Window, we are following Elspeth spindle, and in her world, magic is outlawed. And there is a virus, like a flu-like illness, and if you get this illness after you recover, sometimes a side effect can be that you now possess magic. And if you do, the king's guards will hunt you down and execute you because nobody is allowed to have magic outside of these entities called providence cards, which are like tarot cards with magical elements. And each card, each type of card, has a different magical component that someone can use. Elspeth is not executed because her family endeavors to hide the fact that she was sick and that she has recovered. And Elspeth hides that her magical skill is that she can absorb providence cards and has a entity living in her head called the Nightmare. And it's so good. And there's political intrigue, and it's, like I said, dark, gothic fantasy. The romance element is so good. And in book 1, it really focuses on Elspeth and on, Raven? Yeah, on Raven and their romance. And then in Two Twisted Crowns, the camera kind of pulls back and we get a more wide lens worldview plot-wise. And so we're following 4 people in book 2 instead of in book 1 where we're just following Elspeth. And I really liked the pulling out and getting to see all these characters. And there's another romance element that is introduced. And like, no disrespect to Elspeth and Raven, but I ate up the second romance so hard. I loved it so much. That second romance in this between, I can't tell you who. But there were two between characters that I didn't much care for in book 1, but boy, once they got introduced in book 2 and started their little will they, won't they? God, I was all in. It was so good. I think if you like a magic system that anybody can do, you should try this series. I really like that this is a series where magic is open to everyone, and it's not a skill. It's not something that you can be born with. Like, these Providence cards really level the playing field for who can have magic and who can't, and I really like that. But mainly, I just love the romance. The romance was so good. Okay, I can't find my copy of my runner-up for the year, so that's embarrassing, but that's okay. My number 2 book, my second favorite book of the whole year, was God Killer by Hannah Kaner. And this book does not get nearly as much love as it should. This is fantasy. So in this world, the gods are really present, and they are very meddlesome, and they are at war with each other constantly, and their wars have disastrous side effects for all the mortals in this world. And at the beginning of the book, there has been this war between gods and this kingdom, and the kingdom has prevailed, and the king has outlawed the worship of gods. And without worship, the gods weaken and can even die if they are forgotten, or if their shrines are destroyed, or if they are left untended. And our main character is a god killer and somebody who goes around and destroys gods' shrines. And this is definitely a political romance, but this is also has such a great found family. There is a romance in here that, again, I just loved. Our main character, and I'm sorry I can't remember her name. I have no idea where my copy is. Again, do not reorganize your shelves before doing this kind of video. It's not a good strategy on my part. But she is so prickly and fiery, and she cares so much, but she has put up so many walls to protect herself over the years, and part of the book is watching her try to pull, or not even try, but watching other people pull those walls down as she begins to care for them. And I loved this book so much. It was such a surprise. It is such a short fantasy book, and it's so impressive what Hannah Kaner is able to do in a short book, especially like as we are in an era of like 600, 700, 800 page fantasy books. And, you know, my number one complaint with these books is that they are too long and could have been edited down. To have such a short, concise, impactful fantasy is such a breath of fresh air when I feel like I'm surrounded by all these massive chunkers. Again, I really love the characters. I love this little found family trio that Hannah Kaner has introduced us to in this book. I cannot wait for the finale to this trilogy to come out later this year. Very nervous about what she's going to do to my babies. I hope everybody is going to be okay. I hope this romance has a satisfying conclusion. And if you like road trip fantasy, I would definitely recommend this because I think it's just such a well done version of that trope. Sure. We'll call it trope. All right, and my number one book of the year is not fantasy. Can you believe it? I can. It's Out of Love by Hazel Hayes. So this got on my radar because Jen Agaton was talking about Hazel Hayes on her channel, and I had never heard of her before. And she's an Irish author, and I wanted to read more Irish authors. And I checked this out from the library and was obsessed. I could not put it down. This is not a romance, but it is romantic. This is the story of a relationship told in reverse. So think, if you're a musical theater fan, think the last 5 years. It's kind of a similar setup. We start at the beginning as our main character, who is unnamed, is at the end of her relationship with her boyfriend. And then we just slowly work back through time. And the book ends on the night that they meet for the first time. And it's so well done. And my battery light is flashing, so we'll see how far I can get through this. It's so well done. I would say it's a love story, but it's a love story about falling in love with yourself, but told in a very unconventional fashion. And I think if you are a romance fan, you would love this, even though there's not an HEA and it's not traditional romance in any way, shape, or form. I really think that this is a lovely love story about all the different types of love in our life besides romantic love. And if you're a fan of the last 5 years, I definitely recommend it because it's a familiar rhythm if you're familiar with that musical. So anyways, those are all my favorite books of 2024. Thank you so much for watching, friends. If you want to leave an emoji to let me know you were here, leave me a heart emoji, and I will talk to you in the next one. Bye!